impressive, um, having watched all 18 hours in the last 2 weeks, is the way in which you tell the story of the Vietnam War by reporting the history. And it's a fairly comprehensive history of the war, although not as detailed as some critics would like. Um, the individual stories of the people who had stories to tell about the war, the Vietnamese and the Americans, um, haven't been heard before. There, there are dozens of stories in this documentary series that I found so compelling, so poignant. The story of the Crocker family, which we didn't see here, but just one American family whose son went off to war. And finally, the way in which the pictures are woven together to form a fabric that is more visceral on the viewer than informative, although it is informative too. I read somewhere that you had 25,000 still pictures to look at.
Um, we actually have a system where we pulled in 100,000 photographs and then we actually logged 25,000 of them. So our colleague Salima El Amin, who's the producer in charge of all the still photographs, I think she and her team looked at 100,000 images and chose 25,000 for us to pull from, and there's 2,000 in the film. So that's kind of the triage from, an enormous number, and that's the digital age allows us to do that. But there's an enormous, incredible record of photography of the war. So,
And the
God bless
film,
her.
is
Film
that mostly
footage.
from the American networks?
I think a good. I don't know the exact breakdown, but we really uh, went around the world. So it's ABC, to a lesser degree, CBS and NBC probably supplied most of the material, and they had more camera. You would know better than I. Think they had more coverage of the war, but there's a lot of BBC in there. There's Agence France Presse. There's Eastern European film companies. So it's really pulling the best from everywhere. Japanese camera crews as well. There's some amazing Japanese reporting on the war as well.
So you had 100,000 photographs, literally thousands of film footage, thousands of feet of film footage, 16 millimeter
Right.
mostly. Um, these were the days before video
Oh,
cameras
absolutely.
and digital recording. Um, and the audio, do you know some of some of which you generated yourselves?
The sound effects, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. 90% of the sound is added. So most of the footage did come silent. Unless there was a correspondent like you speaking, then that picture and sound are married together. But a lot of the footage that we used that was raw footage, we had to add all the sound. And that's layers and layers of sound effects to kind of make it come alive.
Anyway, the overall effect of the 18 hours, even for someone who had experienced much of the war, is devastating. It really genuinely is. To be able to walk the line between the controversial aspects and arguments about the war, which to this day is continuing among historians, among amateur students of the war, you've walked a very fine line. Were you conscious of that all the time?
We were very conscious that we didn't want the film to be an argument. And in fact, I remember being asked many times, what's your argument? What argument are you going to make about the war? And we felt the gravity of the story required us to not make an argument and try to just find out what happened, which is not so easy to do. Many of the facts are in dispute. The record is incomplete. There are arguments ongoing. So we really tried our best by assembling a panel of advisors, including Jack and other people who have different aspects and expertise, to try to hear from as many different perspectives as possible, and then to really be dispassionate and not get into an argument. And then the argument or the conversation, we hope, could continue once our audiences have seen the film, and then, make up your own mind what you think. You don't need us to tell you. And that's really what we tried to do. It's not easy, but it was really important that we didn't think we needed to make another argument about the war. Yeah.
I watched one of the episodes with a guy who had been an anti-war activist during the war, a professor of journalism and sociology at Columbia by the name of Todd Gitlin. And here's what he wrote in the Nation, an American magazine. It's just one paragraph. The film is several things. It is an immersion experience, an environment, a soundscape, video, pictures, clips, and it's also an argument. As a total experience, this film says, what an abomination. The Americans should not have been there. They had no business being there. Insofar as there's an argument threading through, it's that the American leaders were overall delusional, ignorant, cynical, deceptive, and destructive.
I guess we're going to get into the realm of semantics, and there's a lot of journalists here, so I'm reluctant to do that, but to my mind, that's not really even an argument. I mean, I think the record really shows that Todd Gitlin is one of our advisors also, and he has a very particular point of view, but I think a lot of the things he's saying are kind of indisputable. So I don't think that was an argument.
I think
I
think it's praise.
Yeah. I mean, we're grateful that he feels that way, and I think one of the things that happened when the film was shown in the U.S. was that it kind of, because it is a visceral and immersive experience, and you got a little bit of that tonight, it kind of broke people down a little bit to just be open to hearing other points of view, especially Vietnamese, but also if you were against the war, hearing what it was like for someone who fought in it. If you fought in it, hearing why someone who protested the war thought that was the patriotic thing to do. And people who stuck with it, sort of to some degree anyway, were able to let go of the old arguments and maybe have a different kind of conversation. And that's what we hoped the film would do.
I was most impressed by what the Vietnamese had to say. All of them seemed to be so candid with you, to the point of contradicting the official party line.
Indeed.
Bao Dinh, who's a fabulous author of a great book about what it was like to be a soldier in the North Vietnamese army, says such surprising things that we hadn't heard before, even in the histories. Another North Vietnamese veteran says at the end of his interview, in which he takes a contrarian view, here's the quote: "Please be careful making your film because I could get in trouble." How did you manage to get these people to talk so freely?
Well, it's a variety of things. The man who said that is the man, the North Vietnamese soldier you saw here, talking about how difficult it was at Con Thien and that they couldn't resupply, and talking about family who died during the Rolling Thunder. So he's pretty important in the film. And he was a colonel, a retired political officer, and was sitting down with him. It was one of the first days of shooting in Vietnam, and we talked about all the things you saw here, and I saved the hard questions for the end. And I had met with him before and sort of explained what we were doing. And what we tried to say was, look, we want to know what the ordinary experience was like for Vietnamese on winning and losing side, and Americans of all perspectives. And our country wants to know what your country went through. And a number of veterans, and we chose people who were willing to be open and frank, but you never really know until the camera goes on what someone's going to say. And I felt in that moment and many other moments there was a sense of, we don't get to talk about this very often, and Americans don't usually come around asking, and we want your country to know what it was really like here, and we want to know what it was really like for your soldiers and people who protested and just what this experience, this tragic, seminal thing was. So yeah, okay, let's do it. And I mean, it was surprising, but on a human level, not that surprising. And I saved for him the hardest question for the end, which was about the really uncontestable thing that happened in the Battle of the Tet Offensive in the city of Hue. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong primarily killed 3,000 civilians. And the Vietnamese government has never admitted that that's what happened. They admit people were killed, but they don't admit that it was a war crime. And he did. And, I was sort of not sure to even ask because it's a very taboo subject there. But he wanted to talk about it. And, he hasn't gotten in trouble. So there's been no consequences except that, okay, I think there's a sense within, and I'm not going to be an expert on contemporary Vietnam, but a willingness in some quarters to recognize that there were, some terrible things happened during the war and that we have to talk about that.
Has the documentary series been shown on Vietnamese television?
It has not been shown on Vietnamese television, but we had the vision in the middle of the production really, that we wanted to subtitle the whole film into Vietnamese for Vietnamese speakers in the U.S. who didn't speak English well enough, people who came to the U.S. As refugees and, the older generation maybe don't speak good enough English to watch the film and to watch it with their children. And so we were in the process of creating a Vietnamese language version, which was extremely challenging and difficult. And we decided that we realized it would be possible that if we put it on PBS in the U.S., it could be streamed in Vietnam. And Vietnam has essentially open internet. And so it was available to be streamed in Vietnam. And there were so many streams in Vietnam that it almost crashed the PBS server the first few days the film was on. So there was tremendous interest in Vietnam. And, we don't have official data. We have a million streams so far that are official. We understand probably it was seen many other ways once it was streamed. So we have a feeling a lot more than 1 million people saw it in Vietnam. And I think the reaction, I can't really speak generally, I can speak anecdotally, was a sense that, wow, we don't know this history. We don't know what it was like in America, and we don't even know what it was like in our own country. And so it's been pretty revelatory and painful, very difficult also. It's opened up some difficult questions, as this scene that we just played about the leadership and about decisions that were made and the kind of human cost of the war that hasn't really been openly discussed is a difficult conversation for Vietnamese to have.
Was there anything that the North Vietnamese told you that you had not heard about or historians had alerted you to?
Wow. That's a good question. I mean, I think some of this material that we just saw in this scene about the impact of the Tet Offensive, I sort of knew, but I didn't really understand it. And I don't think I fully appreciated how little information people had at the time and how sort of pervasive the propaganda was. So people talking about that was important, I think. Yeah, the sense of, someone described it as being in the bottom of a well and looking up and thinking that little circle is the entire universe. That's kind of the limitation of how much information people had in North Vietnam at that time. And I don't think I could have, I maybe had read that, but, hearing people explain it was different. Yeah.
There's a wonderful scene that I hadn't seen before. It's the American ambassador, Ellsworth Bunker, saying in 1967 that he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the correspondent, Bert Quint, says to him, "But sir, how long is the tunnel?"
And he sort of says, well, it's kind of hard to say in a situation like this, and he doesn't really answer, obviously. Yeah. Long tunnel.
He was a nebbish. You use a lot of reporting, maybe not a lot of, but just enough excerpts from, like that clip of mine from Con Tien, of journalists particularly TV reporters, with brief episodic events. Howard Tuckner of NBC when he was wounded, just very important little clips from through the war. Did you consider including in the 18 hours an interview with any journalists who had covered the war, asking them how they could go to such lengths to risk their lives to cover the war, to go back to it again and again and again, when the soldiers thought the journalists were crazy, were insane to be out there taking it?
Yes. I mean, I think that's when we started the film, we had cast our net very wide in terms of what we thought we would do, and we thought we would follow that path more than we ended up doing. It was definitely important, and somehow over the course of collecting all of this material, we sort of ended up not following that lead as much as I wish we had. It was important. And I agree, soldiers would, just be astonished that the reporters could go home, and why are you here? You could leave. And we just didn't, we have more of that material that we ended up putting in the film, unfortunately.
So I'll give you the answer now.
Please.
It was the biggest story in the world. And as a journalist, especially a young, single, unattached journalist, to be assigned to go to Vietnam was a privilege. To be chosen by your newspaper or television network to go to Vietnam was something you wanted to do and campaigned for in some cases. I must point out that Neil Sheehan, who discovered and studied and wrote up the Pentagon Papers for the New York Times, and who wrote a multiple award-winning book about the Vietnam War after it was over, is featured prominently in your documentary series. He's a very intelligent man. And
he does say that he said it was like the greatest thing that could happen to you was to get to go to cover a war. It was the place to be. Everybody wanted to be there.
Yes.
Yeah. And at the time he's describing, he was there early in 1963, along with a small group of American reporters that were there. They felt that we needed to win the war, and they wanted to help tell the story so that it would, contribute to the war effort, essentially. And they began to understand from the younger Army officers that it wasn't going well. And they wanted to get that story out because they worried that the higher-ups weren't listening to it. And they thought that if they could just get the right story into the newspapers about how badly the war was going, then we would change our military strategy and we would be able to win the war. So that, given the sense subsequently that the media was somehow biased against the war, he started off way over here, and only by spending time in Vietnam and seeing, eventually coming to feel that it was unwinnable and we should not be there. He went through a huge evolution over the 10 years or 9 years that he was involved.
There are prominent people who still believe that journalists lost the war.
Yes, there are.
One of the high points, maybe the first one that I truly appreciated, that I was delighted by in your series, is a picture of Walter Cronkite, who was my boss, making his famous declaration on television in 1968 after going to Vietnam himself and covering some of the battle in Hue, interviewing everyone from Westmoreland down, including some of his fellow journalists, on television with his summation, at the end of which he says, it's time to negotiate. We're in a stalemate that's not going to go away, and we're an honorable people, and on and on.
Best we could, I believe, is what he said, right?
Who did the best we could. That was a real turning point by most historians' view. But in your film, we haven't talked about the music, which is a separate subject, but in your film, it's synced up so that Cronkite is appearing with his, framed by a little TV set of 1968, saying that the war cannot be won, as Grace Slick finishes the last few bars of White Rabbit in which the lyrics are, "Feed your head." It's very low level, but I thought to myself, who on earth thought that up? It was.
A very good editor, a wonderful editor, Eric Ewers, is responsible for that. Yeah, very talented. Yeah.
I want to tell a story that relates to to the war and to your film and to the clip we just saw. It the narrator says in the film that the bombs did not always hit their targets, and we see pictures of of collateral damage. I remember during the war thinking, how could the Air Force, the Navy, and Marines pilots be bombing hospitals and schools and private homes and markets? And we knew they were because the Vietnamese were releasing the footage, pictures. It was grainy old black and white, but clearly a lot of bombs were hitting civilian targets. And a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who is a retired, now 83-year-old Air Force pilot, he flew F-4s from Thailand over Pac 6, which was Hanoi, Haiphong. I think he flew 9 missions, and he was riding in the car to the airport, and he was describing to me what it was like to fly through that kind of flak, which was more intense than anything from World War II. And I asked him to tell me what the evasive procedure was when the alarm went off in his cockpit that there was a surface-to-air missile on his tail or had been fired. And the Navy and the Air Force had worked out an elaborate radar system to be able to communicate to the pilots when a missile had been launched and was on a trajectory from the ground to your plane. And my friend Bud said, well, as soon as the alarm went off, you pickled, which he explained meant you released your bomb load before you'd got to the target. And then he turned and looked at me and said, what the hell, you were over North Vietnam anyway. Which was saying to me, his friend, who cared where the bombs fell? Because the next thing, having lightened the load of the airplane, they could take evasive action. They could turn, dive, and usually get away from the missile. The fact that they didn't care, but were unable to do anything about it, is another of the many tragedies, individual tragedies of the war.
Yeah, there's just a big disconnect, I think, between the people making the decisions, and they have to be very abstract, like the conversation between McNamara and LBJ. We're just not killing enough of them. If we could just kill a few more, maybe they can't keep this up indefinitely. That kind of way of thinking about what you're doing is amoral at best, and how many more people do you have to kill to win the war? And when they're talking about people, they're not necessarily talking about soldiers. So that's the whole calculus from the beginning. And it's that sensibility isn't just the pilot with the bombs, it's the artillery guy shooting off into the night just to make it hard for the Viet Cong to run around. So you just shoot artillery randomly and hope that discourages people from going out at night, or free fire zones. You just shoot if anyone's walking. You shoot first, ask questions later. So many ways in which the military kind of created the rules for the war really privileged American life over Vietnamese life over and over and over again. And the question, who are the Viet Cong and what makes them tick? I mean, we don't have this in the film. It was too complicated to explain, but they really were trying to find the reasons why they felt that the people who joined the Viet Cong were being coerced somehow, and they couldn't really accept or understand on some level that some of the reasons why people were joining the revolution, the resistance, was because of our military tactics. And not only there's not only one reason, but that's not a small part. And that's sort of what Neil Sheehan and his the reporters that he was close to, David Halberstam and Malcolm Brown, early in the war, were trying to say, the way you're fighting the war, you're going to turn the people against you if they're not already. And that's aside from the fact that it's an enormous loss of life, millions of people, it's also counterproductive. So on both levels, it's pretty problematic and hard to face.
One of the people you interviewed in the series, an Army advisor named James Willibanks, has an observation that contains an important kernel of truth. He's talking about the inability of the American leaders, particularly McNamara, Johnson, and the rest, to understand what was motivating the North Vietnamese, particularly in the talks, but also on the battlefield. And here's what he said. What the problem then becomes is that you keep trying to send messages that are rational, based on your judgment of rationality, but have nothing to do with the definition of rationality on the other side. So what's irrational to us is totally rational to the other side, if you've decided that you're going to reunify the two Vietnams, no matter what it takes, no matter how many casualties.
Yeah, I mean, hard to argue with that. There's colossal and tragic misunderstandings on so many levels. LBJ was always saying, I could just get Ho Chi Minh in a room, I could talk to him, and, we could just talk man to man. Having, first of all, no understanding of the fact that after 1963 and probably earlier, Ho Chi Minh is actually not the most important, powerful person in North Vietnam. Le Duan, the man that we referred to in the scene about the reaction to the Tet Offensive, is really much more in control of the Politburo and of the direction of the war and of the policies that are being made. And Ho Chi Minh, in fact, was not in favor of the Tet Offensive, among many other things. He really didn't have, he was a revered leader of the country, father of the country, but he did not agree with the strategy of escalating the war in the South and was marginalized as a result. So Ho Chi Minh thought he was trying, Johnson thought he was trying to send a message to Ho Chi Minh, but that wasn't the person he needed to be communicating with on some level. So it's just tragic misunderstandings on so many levels.
I'd like to finish with a little story, and then
Great.
It's back to you.
Please.
I was watching TV in around 1995, and the news was on ITN, and they had a feature from Hanoi about the fact that the United States had sent a trade representative who was also a diplomat, the first American official to go to Vietnam. He happened to be an American pilot, and they're doing the interview in his office in Hanoi, and to illustrate the fact that the Vietnamese had changed their economic system to allow some forms of capitalism, but a lot of foreign investment, with pictures of hotels going up, 5-star hotels being built, and Western shops, and Japanese businesses, and foreign businessmen water skiing on the lake in Hanoi. And the ITN reporter asks him a question, and the American veteran says, it would have been a lot easier if they had just let us win the war. You don't find much humor in the Vietnam War, but I thought that was really funny.
Yeah. We tried to find humor every once in a while. It was not easy. A lot of black humor. Pretty much irony and black humor is, the only humor we could come up with, really. Yeah.
Do you feel a sense of relief? It's the longest, most expensive, most complicated project you've ever undertaken, and you have worked with Burns before.